Hi, this is Jeff with FrostyGarden.com. We're getting towards the end of our growing season here in Alaska, and so that means we're doing a ton of food preservation. Today's topic is going to be about our very favorite food preservation technique called Blanching Freeze. We're going to go through it, tell you what it's all about, and why we use it. If this sounds like something you'd be interested in, you're going to want to watch this video. A huge part of maximizing your garden production is the use of preservation techniques. Most gardens can produce much more food than you can reasonably use in a short period of time while the food is fresh. So preserving it allows you to use it over a much longer period of time. There's a lot of different food preservation techniques out there, and you might choose one or another based on the crop, but we find Blanching Freeze extremely versatile across a lot of different crops that we grow. We use most food preservation techniques across our garden, but over the years we've gravitated more and more towards Blanching Freeze as our go-to technique. The reason is that it has a lot of advantages and very few drawbacks, plus it's highly beneficial for capturing the nutrition in our homegrown food. We really like Blanching Freeze food preservation because it's an extremely fast preservation technique. In the hustle and bustle of our harvest season, having a fast preservation technique is really good. Also, it doesn't require a lot of specialty tools like, say, canning, where you have to have equipment that is specialized for that particular process. It's generally low effort, is what we would say. Also, there's very little food safety that's involved. Because you're freezing the food, food safety is not as big a factor as it is with things like canning. So what is the Blanching Freeze technique? Well, obviously it involves blanching. So what is that? Well, that is the process of dunking your foods into boiling hot water, and you keep it in that hot water for a specific timed interval. That interval might be different based on the preparation or type of food that you are preserving. But after that interval expires, you take the food out of the boiling water and you immediately dunk it into ice cold water to arrest the cooking process. From here, you can dry out the foods and safely freeze them. So what's actually going on with this food preservation process? Well, it has to do with the enzymes in the food, and enzymes are responsible for the breaking down of food. It also deals with nutritional loss and the eventual rotting of food itself. The blanching process will actually stop the enzymatic process in the food. It's not actually cooking your food. You actually cook the food later, but this is basically so that you can store it in a freezer for long periods of time without concern of it degrading. If you skip the blanching step and just freeze your foods right away, those enzymes are still going to be active. Even the freezer isn't enough to slow down the process. The difference in preservation times is stark between blanching and not blanching your foods. While you can technically skip this step, you're only going to get about 1 to 3 months of storage in your freezer if you don't first blanch your foods, but if you blanch them, you can get 9 to 12 months. That's often enough to get into the next growing season, which is more than enough for our needs. If you're concerned about food safety, we are too. We're not making this stuff up. We generally use the guidelines from the University of Minnesota's Extension Service as our entire process for Blanching Freeze. And while that resource is not necessarily comprehensive across every single kind of food you might want to preserve, it gets you 90% of the way there. Also, if you prefer written form, we've documented this entire process, and you'll find a link down in the video description that takes you to that article. There is definitely a stigma when it comes to frozen foods. A lot of people think of it as second best to fresh foods, and we think that's particularly misguided, and a lot of that information is actually based in myth. The truth is that frozen foods contains nearly all of the same nutrition as fresh foods do, and there's other benefits as well. One of the things that we like best about the Blanching Freeze process is that it retains the original texture of the food better than other preservation techniques, especially when you compare it to something like canning, which will obliterate any texture that the food had to begin with. We also think that freezing our foods is a very important tool when it comes to food security, especially in places like where we are, where growing all year round is not feasible. Lastly, technically frozen foods that have been properly blanched can last indefinitely. While we did provide some guidelines previously, those are more about food quality than they are about food safety, and technically, as long as the food remains frozen, it can last indefinitely in your freezer. A few items and tools are needed in order to practice the blanch and freeze preservation technique. As we mentioned previously, none of these are particularly specialized, and there are a few quality of life items you might want to have. To practice blanch and freeze, you're going to need a working space, a stovetop or outdoor burner, stirring spatula, large stock pot, a few decent-sized bowls, ice water, towels, Ziploc freezer grade bags, and optionally a 6 to 8 quart strainer that will fit in your stock pot. This is definitely a quality of life thing, and it's really nice to have, but you can just fish the foods out of the boiling water and the ice water if you need to. This section is going to cover the amount of time that you want to blanch each kind of food for. Please note that your blanching times can vary based on the food that you're trying to preserve and even the size or preparation of those particular foods. Again, all this information and timing is based on the University of Minnesota's Extension Service information. While this list is not exhaustive and there are other foods that you can preserve using this technique, you might have to do a little bit of research on the internet to figure out how long you need to blanch those particular foods for. It's ideal to perform the blanch and freeze preservation process as close to your harvest as possible. Again, those enzymes are responsible for nutritional degradation in your food. A lot of people don't know this, but food can degrade by as much as 50% in its nutritional value within the first week of it being harvested. This is one of the big reasons that we grow our own a lot, is because it's much better for you than grocery store bought foods. It's important to know that some foods cannot be run through the blanch and freeze process. This list of foods requires 100% cooking of the foods prior to freezing. It's not that you can't freeze them, it's just that it's not safe to only blanch them and they must be fully cooked prior to freezing. Although we talked briefly about the process of blanch and freeze earlier, we're going to walk you through the process in more detail now. Again, most foods are going to follow this exact same process. The only thing that's going to vary is the amount of time that you're blanching those foods for. This preservation technique is going to start by preparing your foods. The first thing you want to do is give your foods a good cleaning. This might be as simple as just rinsing them off, but for cruciferous vegetables like broccoli and cabbage, you want to soak them in a lightly salted brine solution for about 15 to 30 minutes. That's just salt with water. And this will make sure that any bugs that have taken up residence in your food get out of there. I don't know about you, but we're not ready to eat bugs yet. From here, you want to prepare the foods how you want them to be eaten. So that might involve slicing, chopping, dicing, peeling, halving, quartering. There's various different kinds of preparations, and you just have to think about how you want that food to be eaten. The next step is to prepare our preservation environment. We generally like to do this process outdoors because it produces a lot of heat and steam. This can certainly be done indoors on your stovetop though. So that means we like to set up an outdoor burner. We also get our water boiling, we get our ice water set up. We also set out any drying towels that we're going to need for the process. We bring our prepared foods out to our preservation environment and generally make sure that we have everything ready before we get started. Before we start our blanching process, we do a quick double check on the amount of time that we're going to blanch our foods for. From here, we dunk our foods into boiling water, and you'll notice when you do this that the boiling process will actually stop very briefly. It's important to not start your blanching clock and the amount of time that you're going to blanch for until you start to see a very light boil start to happen in the water. And once that happens, then go ahead and start your timer, blanch the foods for the predicted amount of time, and remove them from the boiling water afterwards. Once your blanching time expires, you want to immediately get your foods out of the boiling water. From here, you want to dunk them into ice cold water. Generally speaking, you want to keep them in the ice cold water for about 30 to 45 seconds, and this ensures that you will fully arrest the cooking process. Again, we don't want to cook our foods, we're just trying to blanch them to stop that enzymatic process. Once you're done with the cooling process, the next step is the drying stage. And so here we like to take our foods and lay them out on some towels, and we leave them there for at least an hour, sometimes a little bit longer, and this ensures all of the moisture gets out of those foods. It's really important to try to reduce as much moisture as possible so that you don't get ice crystals forming on your foods when they're frozen. Once your food is properly dried, you can go into the packaging step. Basically, what we like to do is put them into Ziploc freezer-grade bags, and oftentimes we will portion out particular amounts. So we might measure 1 cup or 2 cups so that we know exactly how much is in each given bag. Also, it's really important to label your bags so you know what's in it, and we generally recommend labeling it with the harvest year as well, so that you know if you have any old frozen food in your freezer when it comes to the next season. At this point in the process, you're pretty much ready for freezing your food. For some kinds of foods like zucchini noodles, we like to make sure that they're flat packed in the bag so that they're a little bit more storable once in the freezer. Also, we try to make sure any air is removed from the bag, at least as best as we can possibly do. From here, basically toss them in the freezer and use them as needed. The last thing we're going to talk about is how we use our blanched and frozen foods. Pretty much you can use them like you would any frozen vegetable. So we usually just toss them in with whatever we're cooking. We don't even bother thawing them first. Your general cooking times are going to be pretty close to any kind of fresh vegetables that you would cook, so you really don't have to radically alter your cooking process. Blanched and frozen food works in pretty much all kinds of dishes. There's really nothing special to it. We think of it as generally an equivalent for fresh foods. So any kind of cooking style, any kind of dish, you can even use your blanched and frozen vegetables as a side dish. Generally speaking, we recommend that you use up your blanched and frozen food within about a year or so. This is enough time to get us into the next growing season, so that's good enough for us. While you can technically use this food indefinitely, it will start to degrade after a year or so, and the quality is going to get less and less as more time goes on. And that's pretty much all there is to the blanch and freeze food preservation process. We hope this primer on the topic has been helpful to you and that you've learned something about food preservation in general. We love this particular technique because it allows us to use our high-quality homegrown foods all winter long. This is especially important for us because we live in a place where it's infeasible for us to grow all year long. Once again, I'm Jeff with FrostyGarden.com, and I'd like to thank you for watching. If you have any comments or questions, we'd love it if you went ahead and put them down below, and we'll try to get back to you on them. As always, if you liked our content, we'd love it if you did all the things. Once again, thanks for watching, and I look forward to seeing you next time.